Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to the beautiful Ware Center, Millersville University's home in downtown Lancaster. It's a beautiful facility, and I'm thrilled to see everyone here tonight for such a wonderful event. I'm Dr. George Drake, and I'm the Dean of the College of Education and Human Services at Millersville. In my second year. I couldn't be happier to be here, to be in the Lancaster County area, and to be at Millersville. We have a great program for you tonight. Tonight's town hall is a result of a very good and new partnership, at least for me, between Millersville and LNP. My new colleague and friend, Jeff Hawks, down here, who you'll meet in a moment. He will talk a little bit more about the specifics of tonight's gathering. But first, I want to talk just briefly about our intent. Our intent is quite simple. It is to hold a community conversation, just to host the conversation. A conversation about what might reside at the intersection of socioeconomics and the education of the children in our community. We will hear from a pair of experts on how, in other communities across this country, models of integration of the former has resulted in some very, very strong outcomes on the latter, as communities undertake these steps to do socioeconomic integration of schools. You'll have a chance as well to pick the brains of a very talented and knowledgeable group of panelists that we have assembled here for you today. I'll introduce them a little bit later. And you will also have the chance to ask them questions. So as you hear tonight's conversation, think about questions that come to mind and be prepared. We will have a pair of runners running up and down the stairs and in and out of the aisles with microphones so that you don't have to go anywhere. You can stay right where you are. We'll bring the mics to you, Phil Donahue style. Yes, true. If you're under the age of 30, turn to someone near you and ask who Phil Donahue is. It's sort of old school. It was before HDTV. I want to take a moment and recognize a few important individuals here in the audience. There are many, many important individuals in the audience, and we'll meet some of them later, but two of them that I want to recognize today are the two leaders, the leaders of the two organizations that are co-sponsoring tonight's event. Mr. Bob Krasny and his wife Hale are here. Bob, thank you. Bob is the publisher of LNP, and we're thrilled to be partnering with you on this. And the other is Dr. John Anderson and his wife Vivian, right here next to the Krasnys. John is the president of Millersville University and has always been a very big supporter of the kinds of things that we're doing in the College of Education and Human Services. So thank you all for being here, and thank you for being so supportive. Finally, since tonight is a sellout, although it doesn't appear that way quite yet, but we sold all 350, well, we didn't sell, we gave away all 350 tickets for this room. Because of that, we have created an overflow space back on the campus of Millersville University in the multipurpose room in Stayer Hall, and we are streaming tonight's proceedings back to them. So if you see that camera up there, you can wave to them. There are nearly 100 people back on campus watching tonight and listening. They will participate in this conversation as well. And for those of you back on campus, if you have questions, you should tweet them to me. And there are faculty in the room that can give you that Twitter handle. So get your questions ready, and I will be near the podium during the question and answer period, and I will work hard to get your questions into the queue, as it were. All right? So, with all of that said, again, I appreciate you being here, and it's my pleasure now to introduce from Lancaster newspapers, Jeff Hawks.
Hello, Lancaster. My job tonight is to provide some context to set the table. Tonight is all about the future. especially the future for our children and grandchildren. And if tonight our glimpse of the future is going to be one where children from diverse backgrounds, impoverished and privileged, learn together, then to get there, as George Santayat said, we must know our past. So let's start there. This was South Duke Street. It's what it looked like 60 years ago. This photo helps to remind us of something that's not all that pleasant to think about: Lancaster's long history of de facto segregation. At one time, housing discrimination was rampant in Lancaster. This neighborhood, with only a few exceptions, was where you lived in Lancaster if you were not white. What you're looking at is the drum and bugle team competition hosted by the Conestoga Elks, the club in Lancaster for black men. These sturdy homes and the many people in the crowd decked out in their Sunday best suggest the vitality of this community. Many black Lancastrians at that time were laborers and housekeepers, yes, but others had started to establish themselves in the middle class, and every parent had the hope that their child would be able to do even better. If you're wondering where on South Duke Street this photo was taken, there's a reason you're drawing a blank. The block where this photo was taken is this. And it's this. In the 1960s, Lancaster demolished homes along South Duke Street and elsewhere across southeast Lancaster to make way for a school and hundreds of units of public housing. The people who lived in the Southeast did not have a say. But the white residents of other neighborhoods made clear they were not going to tolerate public housing on their turf. This front page is from 1970, and the picture shows the hundreds of white protesters marching on City Hall to fight public housing on their turf. A plan was being considered for Cabbage Hill area, the southwest part of the city. It was not built. So, add to that, mix in discrimination in employment and in lending, and it's clear there's a reason why poverty is concentrated today in Lancaster's southeast. It didn't just happen. It was made to happen. Today, 3 census tracts in the city now have poverty rates exceeding 40%. They are on this map in red. One of those tracts in the southeast now has a poverty rate of 54%. Nowhere else in Lancaster County is poverty so concentrated. Nowhere else even comes close. Concentrated poverty has consequences. One is that neighborhoods of high poverty produce high poverty schools. What did I do? I don't know what I did.
Which one is yours, the first one?
It's this one here. Okay, I think we're good. Thanks, Stuart. Sorry about that, folks. Children from economically disadvantaged homes, no matter what their ethnic background, are more likely than other children to enter kindergarten not ready to learn. If year after year they remain in classrooms where almost all the other children have similar disadvantages, academic progress can be stunted. At King, more than half of the disadvantaged kids are failing the state's standardized English and math test. At nearby Washington Elementary, the percentage is even higher, hitting 88% failure in math. At Carter and McRae, Fulton Elementary, it's pretty much the same story. Ditto for Price Elementary and Lafayette. What's happening next door? What's happening in a neighboring school district? Well, frankly, something very interesting is happening. We're going to look at the 6 elementary schools in Manheim Township, but really we could have looked at schools in Conestoga Valley, Hempfield, Lampeter, Strasburg, Penn Manor. At all of these suburban schools, the percentage of disadvantaged students is less than half of the student body. And at these schools, the disadvantaged students are performing better academically than their peers in the high-poverty schools we just looked at. At Reidenbaugh, Nittrower, Neff, Schaefer, Bucher, Brecht, only 30 to 50% of disadvantaged students at these schools are underperforming on state tests. So pulling this together, we see that in 6 city schools where on average 97% of the students are disadvantaged, more than 2/3 are failing. But in 6 suburban schools where on average only 1/3 of the students are disadvantaged, roughly 45% of these students are failing. That's a 20-point gap. So what's going on here? Are disadvantaged Manheim Township students doing better because of a lower student-teacher ratio? That's not the case. Okay, so maybe Manheim Township students, maybe more money is being spent per student. It's not the case either. The difference in academic performance just may be this. On the one hand, are classrooms where almost every student is disadvantaged, and on the other hand, are classrooms where 2/3 of the students come from middle-class families. Social researchers keep looking at this dynamic, and their studies keep suggesting that socioeconomic integration might be the magic sauce. Our keynote speaker tonight, Richard Kallenberg, will address the research in greater detail. But let's be clear about how public education is organized in Lancaster County today. All of the elementary schools in the Lancaster district, the red ones on this map, have a poverty rate north of 75%. But each of those schools is not more than 2 or 3 miles away from the nearest low-poverty school, the ones here in blue, none of which is in the school district of Lancaster. The future of our kids is being shaped by arbitrary school boundaries. School districts understandably look inward. School boards work for children of the parents who elected them. To borrow a farming analogy, they operate in silos. But our community has another farming analogy too. When a barn in Amish country burns down, neighbors show up to help build it. Neighbors help neighbors. So here's the question. Can we as a community climb out of our silos and help every student, no matter where he or she lives, have a shot at being the best he or she can be? Is there anything we can do as a community to start to repair the damage wrought by Lancaster's legacy of segregation? Richard Kallenberg, our keynote speaker tonight, thinks there is. Richard is a senior fellow at the Century Foundation, where he writes about education issues with great insight and persuasiveness. Richard is a graduate of Harvard and Harvard Law School. Richard has been especially diligent about digging into the research on socioeconomic school integration, and the studies go back decades, and making it understandable to people like you and me. Richard has been called the intellectual father of the economic integration movement. He is the author of 5 books. His articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, and other publications. And tonight, Lancaster, we are lucky to have him all to ourselves. It is with great pleasure, then, that I introduce Richard Kallenberg.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you all for coming. I want to begin by acknowledging Bob Kresny and Jeff Hawks of LNP and John Anderson and George Drake of Millersville University for hosting this discussion. And I want to just say, Jeff has articulated some very difficult history, and I admire all of you for participating in this discussion and facing these issues head on. There are a lot of communities that share a history like Lancaster and are looking the other way. And so I commend you all for taking this issue on. So I want to talk about a couple of things. First, to outline why school integration matters, and Jeff gave us a good flavor for why that may be. But then to talk in very practical terms about how the idea of socioeconomic integration, that is, bringing children together from different economic backgrounds to learn together, how that can apply here in Lancaster, drawing on the experiences of other communities that have managed to pull this off. I have found over the years that when I raise the issue of school integration, people of a certain age have their minds go back to places like Boston in 1975, where there was compulsory busing and a huge backlash against integration. And I want to be clear from the outset that that's not what other communities are doing today. We've learned a lot about how to integrate schools, and it can be done through choice and through positive incentives to bring children of different backgrounds together. And it's a different type of approach than we saw in the racial desegregation era. So let me begin with this question of why socioeconomic integration matters. And to my mind, it goes to the very core of why we have public schools in the first place. So I think there are two principal reasons for public education in this country. One is to provide students with skills to participate in the private sector economy. Social mobility has been central to the American identity, and public schools are all about that, providing children, no matter their economic or racial or ethnic background, the opportunity to do their best and to flourish. The other reason we have public schools is because we need social cohesion. We have people from all across the world coming to the United States, different races, different religions, people coming with different languages, and the public schools have been part of the genius of why Americans are able, from all those diverse backgrounds, to have a common identity. It's been tested in this recent election. But there's still this ideal that public schools can be a place to teach students from wherever they come from what it means to be an American. And so socioeconomic integration, bringing children of different economic backgrounds together, will serve those two fundamental purposes: social mobility in the market economy and social cohesion in our American democracy. Okay, so as Jeff mentioned, there is really 50 years of research to suggest that one of the best things you can do for low-income students is to give them a chance to attend socioeconomically integrated rather than economically segregated schools. So kind of the grandfather of education studies was the Coleman Report back in 1966. And it came out of the Civil Rights Act, and it was the largest social science experiment, study at the time. And they were trying to figure out, well, why do some schools work better than others? And what predicts academic achievement? And it turns out the number one predictor is the socioeconomic status of the family that a child comes from. So a child who is born into a family where the parents are educated and wealthier, on average, have higher levels of achievement. So that was the biggest predictor. The second biggest predictor was not, as Jeff mentioned, per pupil expenditure or student-teacher ratios. It was the socioeconomic status of the classmates in the schools that a child attends. So attending a socioeconomically segregated school, one with high concentrations of poverty, had a negative effect on academic achievement. And having access to economically mixed schools where there were a fair number of middle-class students had a positive effect. The research is also suggestive of the benefits of socioeconomic integration across the world. So if you look at for example, at a study known as the PISA, which looks at math and science achievement, it turns out that across the world, this phenomenon holds, that students in schools that have more middle-class students are more likely to do better controlling for their own home environment than students who attend higher poverty schools. And some of you who look at education issues may know that Finland is one of the most remarkable success stories in terms of academic achievement of students. And people are spending a lot of time trying to figure out, well, what is Finland doing? And it turns out of the dozens of countries that are examined under the PISA exam, Finland has low poverty rates, and not only that, the poor kids who do live in Finland tend to go to economically integrated schools. There are very, very few Finnish schools that have high poverty concentrations. And researchers are suggesting this may have something to do with the success levels. Now, we all know of high poverty schools that work, and folks in the media often will write about those encouraging stories where a charismatic principal is able to bring in some great teachers, and a school that has poverty concentrations manages to do well for a couple of years. But the odds are against those schools being successful over the long term. So when we look at schools that are highly successful academically, it turns out that middle-class schools, and in this particular study they defined it as schools with lower than 50% of students who are low income, defined as eligible for free and reduced price lunch. Those with less than 50% were 22 times as likely to be successful as the high poverty schools that had, in that study, more than 50% low income. Now, that's partly true because of those two factors that Coleman looked at, the influence of family and the influence of schooling. But then when you separate that, we have data on how low-income and middle-class students do in different types of schools with different amounts of concentrated poverty. So these are the results from the 4th grade math National Assessment for Educational Progress. And many of you may know the NAEP is considered kind of the gold standard of testing. It's administered periodically and is a rigorous exam that tests real skills. So you can see that the top set of figures is the middle-class students, those not eligible for free and reduced price lunch. And the bottom line are the low-income students, those eligible for free and reduced price lunch. And you can see as we go from left to right, we're going from low poverty schools to higher poverty schools. And the data clearly suggests that no one does particularly well in the most high poverty schools. Middle class students do worse and low income students do worse. But what's interesting is that Low-income students, when given the chance to attend lower poverty schools, are performing better than middle-class students who are stuck in high poverty schools. So there's a strong incentive to move away from high poverty schools. Now, part of the reason for this phenomenon might be the issue of self-selection. That is, you might have the most motivated low-income families moving into, making sure that they get their kids into really strong schools in middle-class school districts. So there's a researcher in Montgomery who looked at that question in Montgomery County, Maryland, right outside of Washington, D.C., and sought to dispose of that question of whether motivation plays into the results. And in Montgomery County, it's a progressive jurisdiction. They have two ways of trying to improve the achievement of low-income kids. One is to spend extra money, about $2,000 extra per pupil, in higher poverty schools in Montgomery County. And the other is to provide the opportunity through a housing program to allow low-income students and their families to live in middle-class neighborhoods. So there's a rule that when a developer builds a certain number of units, she has to set aside a percentage of new housing units for low-income families. So there's a nice experiment here. The question is, if you're a low-income student, where would you rather be? Would you rather be in the school that has higher concentrations of poverty and spends extra money for good things like reduced class size in the early grades, better professional development for teachers, extended learning time, or would you rather be in the school that spends less but has lots of middle-class classmates? And Heather Schwartz, I should step back and say, and one of the nice things about this research project is that families apply for public housing and then are randomly assigned to either the lower poverty schools and communities or higher poverty schools and communities. And Heather Schwartz of Rand Corporation found that students, over time, students in the green zone, which were the more affluent schools that spend less per pupil, did far better in math than those in the red zone schools. Those are the higher poverty schools that spend more per pupil. And you'll notice it didn't happen right away. There's an adjustment period for low-income students who are in middle-class neighborhoods and in middle-class schools. But over time, there was a very powerful effect to attending a middle-class school, positive effect. So in the way she quantified this was it's a 0.4 of a standard deviation better in math. That is a very large positive effect. Usually you get a 0.1 standard deviation positive effect for other types of interventions. I should mention that this was an experiment in which families had the opportunity to live in middle-class neighborhoods and send their kids to middle-class schools. So the question became, was it living in the neighborhood or going to the school that mattered more? And Heather Schwartz found that about 2/3 of the positive effect was due to the school environment and 1/3 due to neighborhood. Okay, so then the question becomes, if there seems to be a positive benefit to attending a middle-class school or economically mixed school, why? Why should it matter whether your classmates are rich or poor? And there are basically three reasons that researchers have identified, having to do with the three sets of actors in any school. So in any school, you have classmates, fellow students, you have parents who are part of the larger school community, and you have teachers along with the principal. And it turns out that being in an economically mixed school is advantageous on all three of these dimensions. So first, consider the impact of peers, your classmates in a school. Research finds that in higher poverty schools, there are higher levels of teacher disrespect that are reported in federal surveys, higher levels of student mobility, and that the peers in high poverty schools have smaller vocabularies. And all three of those things can be linked to academic achievement outcomes. So obviously you want to be in a school where there are fewer incidences of teacher disrespect or disorder in the classroom. It's common sense that more learning goes on when there's less disruption. When there's poverty concentrated so that the peer influence isn't necessarily positive, there can be higher levels of teacher disrespect. The second issue is student mobility. Any teacher will tell you that it's an advantage to be in a school where there is a stable population, where you don't have students coming into the classroom in the middle of the year and leaving, because a teacher tries to establish certain norms and a set of rules in a classroom, and it's disruptive when there's a constant churn of students. For a variety of reasons, low-income families move much more often. Some of you may have seen the new book, Evicted, by Matthew Desmond, that has talked about this growing phenomenon in which low-income families are forced to move. And the point here is that when poverty is concentrated, it's much more difficult for teachers to do their job because there's constant churn of students. We also know that students are learning from one another all the time, and that it's an advantage to be in a school where you're going to be learning academically from your peers. There is research going back many years to find that the vocabulary size of low-income students is much smaller on average, these are all averages, than the children of professionals. And so a low-income student who has a chance to go to an economically mixed school is more likely to be surrounded by peers who have larger vocabularies, and that will rub off on students in a positive way over time. So that's the first factor, is the classmates. The second is the parental involvement. And there's a long line of research to suggest that it's an advantage in the aggregate for students to be in a school where parents are actively involved, where parents are volunteering in the classroom to help teachers out, where parents are making financial donations to a school. And not surprisingly, those things happen much more often in economically mixed schools than in high poverty schools. So middle-class parents are about 4 times as likely to be members of the PTA as low-income parents, are about half as likely to volunteer in class. Let me pause here and say, in no way am I suggesting that, that low-income parents have any less dedication to their kids' education. That's not the issue here. If you are working 3 jobs, if you don't have a car to get to the PTA meeting, it's understandable that there are going to be lower levels of involvement. But that doesn't, the source of the problem doesn't really matter. The bottom line is it's an advantage to be in a school where there are some parents who have the wherewithal to be actively involved. And so having an economic mix in the school ensures that all schools will have that core of active parents. The final piece is the teachers. And on one level, if life were fair, the low-income students would have the best teachers because they need them the most. And in fact, we know on average the opposite happens. Again, let me reiterate, I'm talking about averages here, and so there are some great teachers in high poverty schools who are doing amazing work. On average, however, in high poverty schools, you have lower levels of experience. You have more teachers who are teaching out of field, which means you have someone, for example, who's trained to teach physical education, teaching chemistry. That happens much more often in high poverty schools than in economically mixed schools. And they're less likely to have master's degrees in high poverty schools. So now I've been focusing on the impact on low income students. What about the impact on middle class students? Well, there's research to suggest that numbers matter. That is to say, if you sprinkled a small number of middle class kids into a high poverty school, that would not be great for those kids for the reasons, all the reasons I've been outlining. Having said that, Coleman and others subsequently have found that the ratio of low income and middle class students matters, and that when you have that strong core of middle class families in a school, that it can benefit low income students and have no negative academic effect on middle class students. So that's on the academic achievement side. Furthermore, there is a growing body of research to suggest that middle class students will benefit from diversity in the school. The Century Foundation recently published a report by Amy Stewart Wells at Teachers College Columbia, which found in essence that diversity makes us smarter. And the reason for that is that when there is a discussion in the classroom, when children bring different life experiences to that discussion, the interaction between students is richer, the learning is deeper than when everyone comes from a very similar background and brings those experiences to the table. That's something that elite public schools and private schools at the college level have been arguing for years. And now there's compelling research at the K through 12 level that diversity is good for the academic learning of all students. Furthermore, when you look down the line, being in a diverse environment at the school level can help prepare children to have those skills that will be important in working in a diverse workforce. It turns out the number one reason people are fired on the job is not that they're incompetent. It's that they cannot get along with other people, including people of different backgrounds. And so developing those skills can be a positive aspect of a child's education. There's furthermore research to suggest that when you look at the costs and benefits of integrating, that the return can be quite substantial. Integrating students, and we're going to talk in a second about the ways to do this, integrating students does cost money because you need to transport kids back and forth. But it turns out that the investment pays off tremendous dividends. Think back to that Montgomery County study where spending $2,000 extra per pupil did not have the same positive effect as integrating the student body. Okay, so how on earth do you do this? How do we create more socioeconomically and integrated schools? I'm going to talk a little bit about some different school districts that are doing this, the use of incentives, emphasizing socioeconomic status over race in student assignment, and a little bit about the politics. First of all, the number of school districts that are pursuing socioeconomic integration plans has skyrocketed. When I started researching this issue in 1996, I found 2 communities educating about 30,000 students between them, which consciously looked at the economic status of the students in deciding where students would attend school. That number has risen to almost 100 at this point, educating about 4 million students. They are spread throughout the United States. They're in red states and blue states, and are found across the country. They are in different types of school districts. So some school districts on the left-hand side of this figure have very few low-income students. Others have very large numbers. So it has worked in a variety, or been implemented in a variety of places. There are a number of ways to get more diversity in the schools. One way, kind of the most popular way, is to redraw boundaries. So when you are building a new school, you can place that school in an area that's socioeconomically diverse and draw the boundaries in a way to ensure socioeconomic diversity. And lots of school districts are using magnet schools, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. Probably one of the best examples of a school district that has effectively promoted socioeconomic diversity is Cambridge, Massachusetts. And there they have a goal that all the schools should be within roughly 10 percentage points plus or minus of the district average. So in that community, they have about 40% of the students who are low income. So you want all the schools to be between 30 and 50% low income. Chicago, which has a very high free and reduced lunch rate. 85% of students in Chicago are low income. And yet I worked with that school district to create a socioeconomic diversity plan for their selective enrollment schools and magnet schools. So a subset of schools are socioeconomically diverse. And they, with the goal that as the confidence in the Chicago public schools increases with those examples, that over time we can integrate more of them. I mentioned Montgomery County, Maryland has the inclusionary housing program, which allows students of different economic backgrounds to go to school together. And New York State has adopted a program in which schools that have been failing are given funds to create special programs that will attract a cross-section of students to try to turn around those schools. Now, what about the opportunities here in Lancaster? I'll reiterate a couple of the points, or underline a couple of the points that Jeff made. First is that the local evidence here is confirming the national research that students, low-income students, who have the chance to go to more affluent schools are performing better in the Lancaster County area than low-income students who are in higher poverty schools. Significantly, if you look at the districts in the elementary schools in Lancaster, about 43% of students are economically disadvantaged. And that provides a real opportunity because you have within this community a majority of students who are middle class. There are opportunities to really expand the number of students who can attend economically mixed schools. And the third point is the distance one that Jeff raised, that many of the middle class schools are within a short distance of the high poverty schools. So we're not dealing with situations like, say, in New York City, where you'd have to go a great distance from some disadvantaged areas in order to create economically integrated schools. It's important to recognize, as I said earlier, that there are positive ways to create school integration that don't rely on compulsory busing. The most effective communities have polled parents, some of whom may be using private school now, to say, well, what kind of special magnet program would be attractive to you if we put it in a Lancaster City school? What might interest you? Where would your child flourish? A lot of communities have been successful by building partnerships between institutions that are prestigious in the community and have credibility and yet are located in cities and so can create special magnet programs. A lot of parents would like to, who work in cities, would like to have their kids nearby, especially when they're young. And so that can be a draw for parents. If it turns out that there's some programs that are particularly popular, then you can franchise those programs and expand them. And in communities like Cambridge and Raleigh, we saw communities that had high numbers of high poverty schools turn around and draw middle-class parents into those schools. I think I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go through this last couple of points quickly. The socioeconomic integration is what I've been talking about. It overlaps a lot with racial integration, and in fact can produce more racial diversity, which is a positive thing. But there are legal constraints on using race in student assignment that the Supreme Court has imposed, and there's no legal problem with using socioeconomic status. Some of the results are quite impressive. In Cambridge, which I've been mentioning, you can see the graduation rates of low-income African-American, Hispanic, and white students compared to the second line is Massachusetts, and the third one is Boston. And you can see as much as 20 percentage point higher graduation rates for the students in Cambridge who are going to these socioeconomically diverse schools than in Boston, where there are concentrations of poverty. And the white students continue to do quite well in Cambridge. The politics of integration are tough, and Stephen Colbert did an episode on Raleigh, North Carolina, where the Tea Party took over the school board for a time and dismantled their integration plan. But the positive story in Raleigh was that different constituency groups came together and supported integration. So the teachers' unions have been supportive of integration in a number of areas because teachers know they can do a better job when they don't have concentrated poverty that is overwhelming. Civil rights groups have been strongly supported, faith-based groups. And in places like Raleigh and St. Louis, it was really the business community that spurred a lot of the effort because business leaders know that they want employees who are doing well, who are skilled in traditional ways, but are also skilled in working in a diverse workforce. I think there are some challenges now in the Trump era that we had one candidate who ran on the slogan of "Stronger Together," and another one who didn't. But I think the discussion that Donald Trump is likely to generate around the idea of school vouchers will actually play into the effort to integrate schools in this way. The argument for school vouchers, private school vouchers, is that poor kids trapped in bad schools deserve something better. And I think that that's a premise that probably all of us can agree with. And then the question becomes, well, what do we do? And we know that private school vouchers are not a popular option, that in state after state, when it's come up on the ballot, people like the idea of public schools. There's a public school ideology in this country. And so if the idea of more choice for students is put on the table politically, and yet people want to keep it within the public school system, that can be a way to generate support for more integrated schools. And I'd mentioned that the day after Donald Trump was elected, I was in Charlotte, North Carolina, working with that school district, and the school board voted 9-0 to adopt an integration plan. And that just underlines that what happens in Washington has only a limited effect on what's happening locally on education issues, where 90% of the dollars spent are state and local. Last thing I want to say, which sounds boilerplate, but I've learned over the years it's really important to say. When people hear me talking about the negative effects of concentrated poverty, some interpret that as meaning that I'm in some fashion denigrating poor kids. And my point is exactly the opposite, that poor kids can do amazing things if given the right environment. But right now, throughout the country and in Lancaster, most low-income students are consigned to high-poverty schools that are not likely to provide that engine for social mobility and social cohesion that our country needs so desperately these days. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Richard. We turn now from Richard's overview of the issue to a specific example of a community where leaders are working to create integrated cross-district schools. That community is Rochester, New York. The group in Rochester spearheading this effort is Great Schools for All. And one of the leaders of Great Schools is here with us tonight. His name is Mark Hare. Mark is a retired newspaperman and author. He worked for 28 years at the Gannett papers in Rochester as a reporter and editorial writer, often exploring the issues of inequities in education. In retirement, Mark has invested his communication skills in the work of Great Schools for All. He also chairs a refugee outreach center, and he is a writing coach for hospice patients wanting to get their thoughts down on paper. When I interviewed Mark last year for a story, he said educational professionals generally understand that integration is not just an amenity or a kumbaya moment, but an important component of equal opportunity. The question, Mark said, is how do you get there? So Mark, come on up. I think that is the question everyone in this auditorium has. How is Rochester trying to get there? And how, maybe in Lancaster, we try to do the same. Mark Hare. So, you're right. You need to... And this is...
So the pressure's on now, I see. Thank you so much for inviting me here tonight. I'm just thrilled to come down and talk to you and share a little bit about our experience in Rochester, what we have done, what we've been doing. And I would say, not to get your hopes up too high, we haven't fixed anything yet, but we are closer than we have ever been. In 1964, the first year that I actually moved to Rochester as a student, riots broke out in the city's old 7th Ward on one hot July Saturday night. And the riots completely took our city establishment by surprise, as you might expect. The newspaper I used to work for wondered days later, why would our Negroes do this to us? Completely unnoticed that thousands and thousands of African American families had moved to the city looking for jobs that weren't there, just oblivious to it until that hot night in July. And those riots accelerated but did not begin decades of white flight to our suburban communities. The exodus today is nearly complete. Once among the most prosperous cities in the Northeast, Rochester is now among the poorest anywhere in the country. Here are a few of the numbers. The poverty rate in the 9-county Rochester area is 14.3%, representing 167,000 people living below the federal poverty line. Rochester continues to be the 5th poorest city in the United States among the top 75 metropolitan areas. Compared with other cities its size, Rochester now ranks 2nd overall in poverty. Overall, 33.8% of our population is poor. Number 1 in child poverty, 52.5%. Number 1 in the rate of extreme poverty, 16.4% of our citizens living at less than half the poverty level. Needless to say, the consequences of this concentrated poverty have been devastating for public education in our city. The Rochester City School District this year has 28,300 students in 50 primary and secondary schools. Nearly 90% of those students come from poor or extremely poor families or neighborhoods. Not a single student body is less than 60% poor, and the average Rochester City School is 87% poor. The official graduation rate hovers at just below 50%, but that overstates the success. In 2015, 15% of city graduates were deemed ready for basic math and English work at our community college. In 2014, according to the New York State Regents, 6% of Rochester graduates were ready for higher level classes at four-year institutions. Of course, there are many individual success stories. There are always children who succeed despite the odds. And never, never underestimate the power of a gifted principal or teacher. But never conflate the success of individuals with the success of a school district. The purpose of public education is to get all our students to the point where they can succeed in life, not to create gauntlets where a few of them will make it through from one side to the other. Rochester is now into its 5th decade, by my count, of school reform, with literally nothing to show for it. We have repeatedly reorganized our school system. K-8 schools became K-4 and 5-8 schools, and then back again. Secondary schools are 9 to 12 buildings today, but they have sometimes been on a regular basis 7 to 12 buildings. We've tried segregated high-poverty magnet schools, sometimes 2 or 3 in a single building on different floors, hoping that smaller schools with smaller communities with catchy-sounding curriculum will fix the program, but it hasn't. We've tried to reinvent neighborhood schools, assuming that if everyone goes to school close to home, more parents will be involved. We've tried to bring an array of health care and social services into schools to make them community centers and provide for human needs so kids can learn. None of it has worked at all. Our school's budget this year is about $800 million. In 5 to 10 years, our city schools will cost $1 billion a year, and unless we make some dramatic changes, we will have outcomes no better than what we could expect literally from chance if we had no school system at all. What we have is not a school system that is just one clever superintendent or one innovative reading program away from a turnaround. What we have, and I use this word carefully but seriously, what we have is catastrophic failure. A very expensive catastrophic failure. The slide perfectly depicts the impact of poverty. I've lost track here somehow where I am. There we go. All right. We use this slide a lot. You can see, you can't read the names underneath on the bottom axis there, but those identify the school districts in our county. We have 19 school districts in our county. The blue line is the percentage of poverty, percentage of kids in poverty failing those tests. The red line is for grade 3 ELA test scores. What happens, as you can see here, is that the failure rate almost directly mirrors the poverty rate from district to district. So the higher the poverty rate, the higher the failure rate, with that big peak in the middle being the city of Rochester itself. The Rochester narrative, the community narrative, I think all cities have a narrative. The Rochester narrative for the last 40 years has been that poverty isn't really a problem in our schools. Poor kids can learn. No disagreement there. Poor kids can learn. The problem is, as the narrative goes, the teachers are bad. Or it's the unions. Those unions, they're really messing everything up for us. Or the parents, they just don't take a role in their kids' education. These terrible outcomes that we see are, in this narrative, this poisonous narrative, the product of character flaws, not a flawed educational system. The idea of integration with poor and middle-class students attending countywide schools has long been considered impossible in Rochester. The belief has been that people move to the suburbs to escape the city and would never consider sending their kids to a school with significant poor and minority populations. In my reporting days, I wrote many times about the problems of high-poverty schools, citing lots of evidence, much of it coming from Rick, for the crises that we're experiencing. But we saw no progress. We just could not change that narrative. Two stories really moved me to want to find a solution to this problem. Our schools represent not just an injustice to the poorest children in our community, but a failure of will that is literally killing our city. Emptying it of the middle-class families essential to reintegrating neighborhoods, growing a tax base, improving property values, and developing new civic and political leaders. In 1998, a number of anti-poverty lawyers took on the case of Amber Painter and several other city school students. Their lawyers all argued all the way to the New York State Court of Appeals that New York's system of school districts, 19 of them in Monroe County, effectively isolated the poor and denied them the sound basic education they are guaranteed by the New York State Constitution. They lost, even though it seemed to me, a non-lawyer, perfectly evident that the plaintiffs had a point. 2 years later, a city mom got caught after she moved her kids in with their grandmother in the suburban town of Greece. She moved them so they could attend suburban schools. She was charged and convicted of theft of educational services for acting to get her kids into a school where they might actually have a chance. So we have a system that forces separate and very unequal schools on communities all across our state that is perfectly legal, while another court says that a mom who gets her kids out of those separate and unequal schools is a felon. I decided that if I ever had the opportunity to be a part of an effort to reverse these outcomes, I would take it. And after I retired, a friend of mine who's a public policy researcher told me that he and a few others were looking to launch just such an effort. He asked me if I was interested, and this time I did not hesitate. In time, we named our crusade Great Schools for All, and we began to do the research and to have the conversations that would lead us to where we are today. We knew the task would be formidable, but most of us are baby boomers who see this as perhaps our last chance to change the policies and practices that we think are destroying our community. And when you get to a certain age and you're retired, what have you got to lose? We are a wholly volunteer organization. We have several hundred members who receive our weekly news alerts and who attend our public events. Our steering committee is about 15 people, ministers, education school professors, lawyers, business leaders, parents, and one old reporter. We know this is a heavy lift. Unlike southern states that have used countywide school systems to achieve socioeconomic diversity, New York State does not permit big city school districts to consolidate with other districts. So we decided very early to develop a plan to achieve the benefits of this integration and diversity on a voluntary basis. Our focus has been on ways communities can achieve productive, socioeconomically integrated schools this way. And here's what we've done. Over 3 years, we've done our research. We've talked with leaders in other communities that have launched efforts to achieve integration, met with scores of local leaders, developed a website with regular blogs, just finished a series of personal videos with people talking about their experiences in high-poverty schools. Last April, we released a report called Breakthrough Schools, in which we laid out in some detail, the evidence that high-poverty schools do not work, that they undermine the success of individual students and threaten the future viability of our city as a place to live and work. We backed up every claim that we made very carefully, citing more than 80 references, studies, papers, books, videos, articles from newspapers, and magazines. We wanted people who are skeptical about the impact of concentrated poverty or about our proposal to be able to easily access the best information, some of it scholarly, much of it much more accessible in popular media outlets. Of course, we don't expect people to read a lot of studies, but we've been very careful to say what the evidence tells us and to make the evidence available. We've been very careful to be truthful and transparent. Our plan calls for a network of theme-based magnet schools, primary and secondary, that would be open to students from any district in our county, all on a voluntary basis. We also said that we would support intentionally diverse inter-district charter schools, which are not really possible in New York State at the moment, and that we would support diverse schools run by area colleges or by colleges in partnership with one or more school districts. Our long-term goal is to build a system of collaborative schools that would assure access to a great school for every child. To do that, we proposed local carve-out legislation that would permit districts to work through our county boards of cooperative educational services. I'm not sure if there's a similar thing in Pennsylvania, but both these institutions already allow districts to purchase career and technical programming that they cannot afford to offer singly. So both these seem to us like a good platform because it offers collaborative services and because it has a well-defined mechanism for the exchange of tuition dollars. There are a few critical ingredients to our Breakthrough Schools proposal that we feel are essential to the success of this voluntary effort. These schools should be run by existing school districts and operated out of existing buildings wherever possible. We want to avoid creating what amounts to a parallel school district with its own new buildings and funding systems. The traditional school districts expecting state aid to reimburse them for the loss of students they no longer have. These schools must have a plan to achieve an approximate 50-50 mix of low-income and middle-income students, and they should offer programming that individual school districts do not or cannot generally afford to offer on their own. The idea is that collaboration not only dramatically improves the graduation rates for the poorest kids, but that it offers distinct advantages to more affluent students as well. So as I said, Great Schools is a strictly volunteer organization. We don't have any plans to run a school ourselves or to administer schools or to design curriculum or any of that. We're just a citizens group. We have secured some foundation funding to help us with some projects, and we hope to secure a little bit more to get a little admin help this year. In 2016, we secured funding that we used to hire a consultant to do some research for us and to develop some inroads into the state educational machinery. And we were able to access a grant to conduct a professional survey of city and suburban parents last spring. We released the results of that survey in June. The key finding is this: 87% of city and suburban parents say they value a diverse educational experience for their children. 80% said they would be more than willing to send their kids outside their home districts to a diverse school, assuming that school offers a curriculum that they would find suitable for their kids. That's a staggering break with the Rochester narrative I just described a minute ago. We've been careful not to exaggerate these results, as dramatic as they are. We've used the survey as a tool when we talk to legislators or school superintendents, not as evidence that most parents will immediately pack up and move their children to some other school district. No, not at all. But that it is now politically safe to talk about school integration and diversity and inter-district magnet schools without fear of a lot of pushback. The survey shows that the old Rochester narrative I described has changed. Today's parents, millennials in their late 20s to early 40s, may leave the city to find better schools for their kids, but many of them would prefer to live in the city if a school were available to them. And nearly all of them intuitively understand that it is important for their kids to learn to navigate an increasingly diverse world and community. They welcome this conversation. Over the last year or so, we've noticed a huge change in the reception we get as we continue to knock on various doors around our community. To superintendents, to school board members, to legislators, to church groups, Here's the change. It may seem subtle, but it's huge. When we started this effort just a few years ago, the main question to us was why? Why would you do this? Why would anybody do this? Why would you think this would work? The question today isn't why, but how. How do you make this happen? That's a sea change. That's a big deal. We no longer encounter any real resistance to the philosophical disagreement with the issues that we've been raising. Our strategy now is to find the best way to answer these questions for someone to go first. We're looking for one or more school districts to propose a countywide magnet school that would run open to students from all districts and intentionally diverse. We don't believe that our legislators are going to support any legislation that we propose until we have players who want to make it happen. So we've been very careful about this now for the last 6 months. I would say we're this close, maybe, to getting someone to take that first step to open the door. We have probably 7 different proposals that we're shopping around, that we're working with school districts on. We're looking for funding for them. And we're volunteers. They should be doing that. But we're looking for funding for them. And we're getting closer, I think. Our hope is that it'll happen this winter, that somebody will go first. I hope that your community has citizens eager to take up this challenge in Lancaster. And let me close by sharing what I believe is our toughest test. And that is this: to act with urgency, the urgency required by the reality that thousands of our children every year are denied the educational opportunities they not only deserve as human beings, but that they are guaranteed by their Constitution, while simultaneously accepting the fact that we need to be patient, that we need to move forward, but we can't make things happen at a pace they're not going to happen at. And that's a terrible dilemma to face. But that's what we have to do. And that's what I guess I would say to any citizen group that comes from Lancaster or anywhere else. Learn to live with that reality. Don't give up. Keep plugging away. Keep making those visits. Keep going back to see the same people. Sooner or later, they will take you seriously. At least they will consider you to be nuisance enough to be dealt with. It's an urgent problem, but you need to be patient. Thank you so much for your inviting me to share this experience with you. I appreciate it an awful lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Richard. I'm going to invite Richard, Mark, and Jeff to come back to the stage and take their place at the podium. And I'd like to get the rest of the panel up as quickly as possible so we have as much time as possible for Q&A. So, in that regard, I ask that you hold all your applause until the end. So, gentlemen, if you might come back up, please. I will begin with the panel who are seated down here. As I call your name, please come on up. I will begin with Pedro Rivera. Pedro is the Pennsylvania Secretary of Education. We all know Pedro, and Pedro has been a lifelong educator. He has served as the superintendent of schools here in Lancaster, and he did so from 2008 to 2015. He's a member of the Basic Ed Funding Commission, which developed a fair and equitable funding formula to reinvest in public schools, appointed to that position by Governor Wolf just last year. Next, we have Representative Mike Sturla. Mike represents the 96th Legislative District, which includes Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He does so in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives. Representative Sturla serves on the boards of the Lancaster County Workforce Investment Board, IU13's Community Advisory Group, and the Stevens College Community Advisory Council. Next, we have Jane Pugliese. Jane is the former director of the Economic Development at the Lancaster County Planning Commission and the former director of the Inner City Group in Lancaster. Her recent master's thesis analyzed socioeconomic, ethnic, and racial demographics of Lancaster County's 65 public elementary schools and their academic performance. That's Lancaster County. And then finally, we have Dr. Tim Mahoney, associate professor and chair of the Department of Ed Foundations and chair of the Teacher Ed Council at Millersville University. Throughout his career, his research has centered on urban education, and he is currently involved in national initiatives and diversity in the workforce. Now, I'm going to ask Jane to begin, give us a brief overview of, just a 1 or 2 minute overview of your master's thesis, and then I'd like to give,
I can do it. I can do it.
that would be the abstract. And then we'll give everybody else on the panel, the new members of the panel, the opportunity to give us 1 or 2 minutes of reflections on what we've heard so far. Then we'll open it up to Q&A, and I'll find my runners with microphones. Jane?
Okay, thank you very much. I am going to keep it to 2 to 3 minutes. My research is, again, based in Lancaster County, and it brings everything that Richard Collenberg and Mark Hare have talked about. It's going to bring it home. My research is actually based on a study that was done almost 10 years ago here in Lancaster County by David Rusk, a noted urban policy consultant and educational researcher. And he did this study under contract with Lancaster County government to look at the public education system as part of an overall economic development study that the county was doing at the time. His study did not see the light of day, perhaps because it was controversial. Just basically the findings of his study on education in Lancaster County was first that the socioeconomic composition of the school's student population was the primary school factor related to student academic performance. He found that the test scores of low-income students in Lancaster County, and he studied the 65 elementary schools here, the test scores of low-income elementary school students improved significantly the more they were surrounded by middle-class students. Of the 4 following school factors, pupil-teacher ratio, instructional dollars per pupil, average years of teaching experience, and years of teacher education, only average years of teaching experience had a significant, although modest, effect on student test scores. He found that countywide, here in Lancaster County, public elementary schools were highly segregated racially, ethnically, and to a lesser degree economically. And he found also that poor Black and Latino students were much more likely to be educated in high poverty, poor performing schools than poor white students. The key findings in my research, which I essentially updated using data from 8 years later, of the same 65 elementary schools, affirmed his findings. There remains a strong, significant, and inverse relationship between school poverty rates and student achievement. And as school poverty rates increased, student academic performance declined here in Lancaster County. And schools with high poverty concentrations, very high poverty concentrations, had precipitous declines in student achievement. Again, there was a low to moderate, but still significant relationship between years of teacher experience and student achievement, although the socioeconomic status of a student's classmates remained the most significant. In Lancaster County, 15 of the county's 65 public elementary schools had high concentrations of poverty, and with one exception, all of those schools are located in the county's 2 urban school districts, Columbia School District and the School District of Lancaster. And those elementary schools with very high concentrations of poverty, above 90%, were all located in the School District of Lancaster. Affirming Mr. Rusk's findings, Black and Latino elementary school students were much more likely to be enrolled in high poverty schools than their white peers. And this is a key element of educational inequality, the disparities in access to high quality education. Experienced teachers were less likely to be found in high poverty schools, arguably where they are needed the most. The corollary to that is that Black and Latino students were thus less likely to be taught by experienced teachers than their white peers. And among the most significant findings from my research was that public elementary school students are highly segregated by race and ethnicity, and white elementary school students are the most isolated of student groups in our county. And this does not bode well for them in the future as they need to learn how to live in an increasingly multicultural world. And in closing, the findings from my research tell a tale of two separate and unequal educational systems here in Lancaster County, where our public elementary schools are divided along racial, ethnic, economic, and geographic fault lines. And so what is to be done? We have a history here of working together across all kinds of boundaries. 20 to 30 years ago, this community came together across municipal boundaries, across political boundaries, to address rapid growth and to promote growth management and the preservation of farmland. And we became a model for that. And I believe we can become a model for how to address educational inequality in our community.
Secretary Rivera, would you care to offer reflections?
I thought I had one person to prepare before I.
Oh, okay.
No, I'm teasing. So I'll take a quick moment to share, I guess, some context that would probably help generate some thoughts and questions from the audience. So just a little about the Department of Education and how we serve here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. First, in our K-12 system, we serve about 1.74 million students across 500 school districts, 173 charter schools, a little over 80 career and technical education centers. When we look at our average percentage of students who live in poverty, we're about, on average, 40%. Some of our highest poverty areas serve 79% students in high poverty, and as low as 13% of students living in high poverty. We also realize when we look at specifically our students of color, in the Commonwealth, we serve about 29% students of color, and even as we look at our high minority or high students of color areas, that we can go as high as 77% students of color, and at the same time as low as 3% students of color. And as I heard some of the data shared, it really told a story that we really started to address and tackle, to discuss as part of leadership in the Commonwealth. And first we have to admit the fact that through a recent national study, PA was ranked as the third most educationally segregated states in the country, behind only Ohio and Alabama, with 6, which is quite a distinction. And you'll hear where we may also make a distinction where, on average, the state spends in the top quartile per student across the country. But when we look at the gap in terms of what's spent in low socioeconomic communities versus high socioeconomic communities, that gap is also amongst the highest in the country. We also have noticed that stands true for NAEP, PISA, and academic scores. So whereas we score on average amongst the highest in the country, the achievement gap between students of color and their counterparts, and poor students and their counterparts, are amongst the highest as well. So, as a result of the data, we've really started to dig deeper and have been really, focused under direction, of course, of the governor and this team. Have been extremely focused on equity and the fact that zip code shouldn't be one of the sole indicators to ensure success for students, in their community, and really started to tackle some issues such as the basic education funding formula. So we were one of 3 states, which you kind of see trends here. We're one of 3 states in the country that didn't have a funding formula. How we funded schools was relatively arbitrary and depended on the tone, the climate, and who was vocal at the time. We're now proud that we're one of the states across the country that has one of the most comprehensive and transparent funding formula that does take poverty into account. Takes concentrated poverty as well as localized poverty. But not only poverty, really also looks at the needs of English language learners, also looks at the needs of tax effort, which we know, really impacts the local community here as well. However, when we're looking at a formula, the formula only works if you make the investment in education. The output is really driven by the input, and the output continues to be, an area that we continue, that we have to advocate around because, as a Commonwealth, we are still very locally funded, very dependent on local tax revenue to drive how much is invested in our children in schools. And we know that, as a result, if we pull out state funding, there are school districts that locally fund students in our schools as high as $13,000 per child. And we have school districts that we pull out state funding only invest $7,000 to $8,000 a child, for their school districts. So in addition to that investment, we also realize we have a flawed system of accountability. It's very interesting. When we started to look deeply, at the data and tried to build an accountability system and tried to build a story around, how and why we need to invest in education in the Commonwealth, we realized that our current system of accountability, which is heavily reliant on standardized tests and achievement on standardized tests, doesn't take some very important factors into account. It doesn't take your percentage of English language learners, doesn't take your percentage or the number of refugee, migrant, or immigrant students you serve, doesn't take special education students, into account, doesn't look at attendance or migration patterns of students. We don't look specifically at whether or not students are offered high-quality programs such as international baccalaureate programs, AP courses, dual enrollment courses, or even the pathway towards career and technical education. So we realized that we're going to be fair and tell a real, tell a story about, how we're investing and how we are failing to invest in our educational system. We first had to take a look at our system of accountability. And so as a result, we were recommending now and are working for moving away from the current school performance profile to the Future Ready PA Index, which would take a much more holistic view of student success. And not just to change our system of accountability, albeit that's extremely important, but we also realize if we're going to address a problem, we have to use formative assessment in a way or in a means in which is intended to, and that's to not only inform instruction moving forward, but inform the investments that are being made. So I think, whereas, the data, is extremely important and we use to drive everything from our investment to our professional development plan, we have to be intentional around what we're measuring. Because far too often, 500 communities, 500 school districts across the Commonwealth create their own story given the same data sets, and we realize, depending on the time of the day, the geographic area we visit, everyone can make a case for what they're given, what they're not given, but in order to really start to level the playing field and make true sound investments in students, we have to first create a system of accountability that's transparent, that's forward-looking. We have to create a system of accountability that really tells a story and that changes this cost per child in education to an investment in education. So there are lots more I can start to discuss. But I think especially in recent times, I'll end here as we're looking at transforming and providing different pathways, for students to best be educated in a diverse, educational setting. One of the things that unfortunately we've learned pretty intensely over the course of the past few years, a focus on multiculturalism and multicultural education is extremely important. Some of what we've learned as we're pushing a change in educational narrative is that we still are really dealing with some issues of intolerance, and a non-focus or an ignoring of the need to create socioeconomically, racially, ethnically, and gender equity, diverse communities, and so when you're looking and we're discussing this issue of integration and diversity, we have to create a foundation that's going to allow for true diversity, that focuses on the needs of every member of the community. So thank you for being here to share.
Thank you very much. Representative Sterla, your reactions to the presentations, please.
Thanks. Well, I jotted down about probably 30 or 40 things here that I wanted to talk about. I'll try and limit it to a dozen, because this literally, 20 years ago, I became a member of the Education Committee in Harrisburg, and I started working pretty much on this issue, and haven't made much progress in 20 years, I will admit, but I think I served on the Basic Ed Funding Commission with Secretary Rivera, and when you're in a room with 15 people that actually want to concentrate on education, you can actually make some progress. The problem is when you then try and expand that out to 250 members of the House and Senate, and they've all got their own axe to grind, and it gets a little tougher. And along those lines, you know, some of the things that we face in Pennsylvania, you know, the first speaker talked about 90 schools that represented about 1 million kids that were looking for socially integrated plans. We have 1.74 million kids enrolled in the state of Pennsylvania and 500 school districts. So we have some school districts with as few as 600 kids in a school district, sitting next to another school district which has 600 kids in a school district, because they each had their own steel mill at one point in time, and be darned if they're going to join those two school districts together, because they were rivals for years. So, you know, we end up with some of that local resistance. And as the Secretary pointed out, we fund about 30%, the state funds about 30% of the cost of education in the state of Pennsylvania. Local school districts fund about 70% of it. When the local school district is funding 70% of it, and you say, I'm going to send you 50 of my kids, the reaction from the other local school district is, over our dead body, will you send us 50 of your kids, because we're going to pay for that. Not you, not the state, not the other school district. So the answer is no. So we run into that all the time. In fact, back 20 years ago, when the state was trying to do distressed school legislation and actually got it passed, the school district of Lancaster was one of those distressed school districts. And at the time, I proposed an amendment on the floor of the House that said, if you are designated as a distressed school district, you could actually, because there was going to be economic punishments if you didn't get yourself out of that dire straits pretty quickly. I said, how about if the school district is able to say, you know what, you're right, we have no clue of how to educate kids, that's why we're distressed, you take over and just reapportion our school district to the adjacent school districts. Well, you can imagine how well that went over. I got about 50 votes for that, and you need 102. And I actually had one member come over to me and grab me by the tie and said, how dare you try and make me educate your kids? To which I said, they aren't really my kids or your kids, they're our kids. And, you know, I mean, when I talk to the business sector, I always say, do you hire employees from one school district and one school district only? And if not, then you should be as concerned about what's going on in a school district 20 miles away from you as you are in the school district where your business is located, because there's a really good likelihood that that's where your employees are going to come from. There and 15 or 20 other school districts, given the proximity of our school districts in this state. So, I mean, part of that is, how do we get past some of those parochial barriers that we have with 500 school districts, a lot of local funding, you know, and I mean, even in the school district of Lancaster, we have open enrollment. Kids can go anywhere in the school district they want to. And you say, well, there you go, that's a solution to it. Except think about this. You're an impoverished family. You've got 3 kids. One is a newborn, the other is 3 years old, and the other is in kindergarten. You just moved across town because, well, you put down your month's deposit and your month's rent. 3 months later, you got evicted from your apartment. So now you move across town. And you say, I want my kid to stay back in that kindergarten class where they started. So on a rainy morning, you've got to pack up your 5-year-old, your 3-year-old, your baby that's in a stroller, and walk them across town to go to school. You know what happens? The next day they say, we're just going to enroll you in the neighborhood school down the street. And so that kid moves to 2 or 3 or 4 schools within the school district in a year's time. My kids went to Fulton Elementary School. At the time, and I think it's probably still the case, 70% turnover rate. They would start in September with 500 kids in the school, and they would end in June with 500 kids in the school. But in that time span, 350 kids had left the school and 350 other kids had come into the school. When I first started talking about that 20 years ago in the Education Committee, people told me I didn't know what I was talking about, that I obviously didn't understand how things work because people don't move that often. And then I said, well, actually, I can get my principal to come up here and explain this to you. And so we had him come testify at a public hearing, to which they said, Mr. Principal, you obviously don't have a clue of what you're talking about with statistics. That can't possibly be the case. When then Superintendent Vicki Phillips became Secretary of Education, I had her testify. And they said, you know, we've been hearing this, but we just didn't believe it. You know, and this was 5-6 years afterwards. So it takes a long time to get people, because their kids had all gone to a school where they graduated with the same kids that they went to kindergarten with. And to give you an example of how you can't just take the performance of a school and say that means that it has bad teachers or it's a bad school. In that school, the year that we were labeled as distressed, I said to the principal, so, you know, I have the ability to move my kids anywhere in the school district or put them in private school. Why should I leave my kids here? And he said, look, we did the 5th grade PSSAs. 87 kids took that test. And on average, they scored in the bottom quartile of statewide averages. That's why we're distressed. I'm like, okay, so again, explain to me why I should stay here. And he said, of the 87 kids, 12 have been in that 5th grade class from the start of school till the end of school. He said, so we disaggregated the scores. Now, you know, there's a part of me that says if those 12 kids were exposed to a really bad situation longer than any of the other kids that had just transitioned through there, those 12 kids should really be disadvantaged. I mean, they had a full year of this horrible school with really bad teachers. The only thing was, when they looked at those 12 kids scored in the top quartile of statewide averages, better than the statewide average, despite the fact that there was 70% turnover in that classroom. Those were some of the best teachers and one of the best schools that you could think of. But you get that kind of transition where they're going through every day, it's going to look like it's a bad situation. You know, pre-K works for kids that are socially disadvantaged. If you take a kid that has a home life where he's getting half the vocabulary as a kid that doesn't, and you say you get to go to pre-K 3, K4, full day kindergarten, you can bring that kid up by the time they reach 1st grade to the same level as a kid that's coming with 2 parents with master's degrees. And, you know, by the same token, if you spend that same amount of money on a kid who's got the 2 parents with master's degrees and give them K3 and K4, it doesn't do anything. Because they can't, you know, you can't take a 3-year-old and make them a 9th grader. It just doesn't happen. So we all have to be smart about the way we do this in terms of spending our dollars and getting it, which is why, I mean, I recently heard one of the president's family is going to propose legislation, which is unique to me, I guess, in terms of, and give tax credits to people who needed to get daycare and, you know, pre-K programs. The people that need this are not the people that need a tax credit. They are in poverty or in deep poverty. They don't pay taxes. Giving them a tax credit is useless. You know, a tax credit for what? The taxes that they don't pay? So, I mean, again, we've got to figure out how we can do this in a better way. I'll do a couple quick things, and then right now, the funding formula that we have in Pennsylvania, I think, is a great funding formula. The only problem is we only apply it to new dollars that we put into the education system. And so we're taking $200 million a year and applying a really fair formula to it, and we're leaving $5 billion under the old system. And at that rate, it's going to take us about 30-plus years to get to equitable funding in the state of Pennsylvania. If you took all the money that we currently have and drove it out through the funding formula that we have, there's a little over 90 school districts that get more than 200% of what they would get under a fair funding formula. One actually gets close to 600% of what they would get under a fair funding formula. There's also 95 school districts that get less than 80% of what they would get, some actually quite a few, less than 50% of what they would get if you drove all that money out. I mean, part of what we also have to do is accelerate closing that disparity that the Secretary talked about. And then there's 1,000 little things we can do. You know, School District of Lancaster knows that I got 25% of the properties in the district are tax exempt. You know, all the surrounding school districts, it's 2 or 3 or 5%. You know, maybe we need to factor that in somehow. The School District of Lancaster identifies over 1,000 homeless students every year. 1,000. So we built some of that kind of stuff into the funding formula, but I don't know that we're going to get enough to compensate for that. In the state of Pennsylvania, if I live in a suburban or rural area, I can stand with my cup of coffee and my bunny slippers at my front door and wave to my children as they get onto a school bus so that they are safely transported to school. And the state reimburses school districts for a portion of that. If my kid lives in the city and has to walk through a drug-infested neighborhood and cross streets that have 30 and 40,000 cars a day worth of traffic on it, the local municipality and the school district pay for those crossing guards. In the city of, and you say, well, how much can that be? In the School District of Lancaster, I think it's $300,000 or $400,000 a year. That's $300,000 or $400,000 that could be going into teaching. In the city of Philadelphia, it's $11 million a year. So, I mean, there are things that we can do that get us to closer to where we need to be in terms of funding, and there's things that we can do in terms of how we balance the socioeconomic parts of it. But with 501 school districts, it's really hard because I saw the school district of Chicago, 85% of the entire school district is in poverty. That's the same with the city of Lancaster. I don't know where you get the balanced middle-class kids that balance out your socioeconomically disadvantaged kids. There's just no kids to have unless we start moving out into the surrounding school districts. And as long as everybody's paying their local share, they don't want it. So, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, so probably, George, you might want to make a note that if you want to have a short panel with 2 minutes, don't involve 2 policymakers and a professor, because there's going to be no time for anyone else to talk.
I thought that was, according to my watch.
So at Millersville, I have the great privilege of working with beginning teachers, and hopefully some of them are sitting there watching us now. But one of the great things about beginning teachers is that they have some pretty interesting understandings of what schools are and what schools do. And so I'm kind of excited, actually, that now this term, alternative facts, has become part of our lexicon. Because educators and policymakers about education have been dealing with alternative facts for some time. And if you're surprised by anything that Richard or Mark or any of us have said, right, that's because you've been paying attention to these alternative facts. Because none of this stuff that anyone said is new. We've known this since the Coleman Report, probably before that. But because they're uncomfortable facts, and facts that we don't necessarily want to recognize, we skate over them, or we ignore them, or we pretend they're not there. And really, I gotta say that you guys out here are the ones responsible for perpetrating those myths on the students that come to my classrooms, because you're the adults that they spend company with, spend time with, pay attention to. Yeah, they don't make up this stuff on their own. I mean, they hear it from us, from adults. Yeah. Let me just give you a couple alternative facts that I heard tonight, right? That maybe we can spend some time thinking about. So, number one, the kind of things that Mark was talking about in Rochester, where all these reforms didn't work, highly predictable. Of course they're not going to work, because the underlying problem of high concentration of poverty hasn't been addressed. You can dump all sorts of money in schools, but if you don't change the concentration of poverty, you will not change the educational outcomes. You won't. If you read Jane's study, which everyone should, she shows that pretty conclusively. I mean, it's too bad we can't see some of the graphs she shows that really illustrate how dramatic that concentration of poverty effect is. So that's one thing. Another thing that I wonder about is that Richard was talking about some of the things, right, that caused the sort of depressed academic achievement in high poverty schools, high concentration of poverty schools. And he put some emphasis on the classmates. And I wonder about that. So like poverty is somehow correlated with increasing teacher disrespect. So I don't know, some of you, Secretary Rivera certainly has done this, some of you may have too, have gone to like a church, right? That many of the people who attend the church are kids who come from these high poverty, high concentration of poverty schools. I don't see when I go to the churches like that, I don't see a whole lot of misbehavior. I don't see a whole lot of kids fidgeting around. I don't see any fights. I see kids dressed to the T, sitting there paying attention. And I think one possible explanation is because what happens in the church, right, is a shared understanding between the pastor and the parents and the kids. They all agree on the point that they're there for. I'm not sure that happens in high concentration of poverty schools, so kids push back. Predictable. Yeah? Another alternative fact that we tend to believe, right? Kids don't know how to behave because they're not taught how to behave at home. I wonder. The third thing is the Heather Schwartz study on Montgomery County in Maryland, right, is conclusive, absolutely conclusive. That, and you know that graph that Richard showed us where the two tails kind of diverge? That was 2012. It's wider now, right? I saw her present in 2015. That gap continues to grow. Kids are doing increasingly better, right? Because we know that when we put kids who come from impoverished families in the company of kids who don't, they do better. Everyone does better. Yeah? I don't think we can worry so much about residential segregation. I think people should be able to live where they want to live. I'm not sure that's a solution. But just because people live in different places doesn't mean they have to go to school in segregated places too. I think we can imagine a different way, right? And if we can imagine a different way, what are we waiting for? And it's really weird, right, as my final alternative fact, that if we know that deconcentrating the poverty of schooling leads to increasing academic outcomes for all students who attend those schools, why would it be illegal in states to do that? What sense does that make? When we know something works and we make it illegal to do, that's alternative facts. I think if you guys want to talk about school choice, that's a good thing to talk about too, because all that's related to some of the things we're talking about. And Richard has a lot of good things to say about vouchers, and that maybe will change some of the alternative facts we come to believe about that. But that depends if somebody wants to ask a question about that, but I'm done.
All right. Thank you, Tim. All right, I'm going to ask John and Jeremy, the two mic runners, to come down. It's easier to see who has a question from up here than it is in the back. But what I'd like to do is invite a couple of special members of the audience to have the first opportunity to ask a question. We'll begin with Damaris Rao here in the front. Damaris is the superintendent of the School District of Lancaster. Damaris, do you have a question?
Yes. Thank you. Good evening, and thank you for coming tonight. Prior to coming to the School District of Lancaster, I worked in New Haven, Connecticut, a district with 18 elementary and middle magnet schools and 8 magnet high schools. I also served as a principal in a magnet school in Greenwich, Connecticut, a very affluent community. As a principal in the affluent school district, my school was specifically designed as a magnet school to integrate our school population, which was predominantly low income and minority. So in addition to an arts theme, free preschool programs for 3- and 4-year-olds, classes of only 16 students in pre-K through first grade, all-day paraprofessionals, just wonderful programs, on and on and on. We were not able to integrate that school because families move to communities where they want to be. And very few parents want to put their child on a bus to go somewhere else to get an education. So I question whether magnet is the answer, but rather ensuring that all students, all schools have the appropriate funding so that kids have access. So it's not about equity, it's not about being equal across a school district like SDOL and other low-income districts, but around equity, providing schools, those schools in SDOL who have a higher level of poverty, like King Elementary, may have more kids in poverty than, let's say, Buchanan. So ensuring that we are getting the funds from both the state and from ourselves and using it in a way that provides equity so every child has exactly what they need and they can still stay in their home community. So I just wanted to find out how you feel about that. Any of you?
I just talked.
If I can build on that a little bit, one of the things we saw in the school district of Lancaster a few years ago was that kids from the school district, particularly minority kids, were not going to the tech schools. And the reason that they gave most often was not that they weren't interested in any of those tech pathways, but in the school district of Lancaster, they were a majority. They were in the majority. When they went to the tech schools, they were in the very few minority, and so it was a foreign place for them to go. And so, I mean, I think that's one of the things that we need to overcome. For the same reason that it was said, some of the kids and parents in the white communities don't want their kids going to inner city schools. The inner city kids didn't want to go hang out with the kids that were all white and you know, running around in hot rod cars and things like that. It just wasn't what they did.
I can respond also to that. I'm not sure. We talked about Heather Schwartz's study where she found that the real key to improving student achievement was socioeconomic integration, not extra funding. So, but you're talking about as long as the school district of Lancaster has adequate funding, we'll be okay, except it still doesn't deal with the high concentration of poverty that still exists in the school district of Lancaster.
I don't disagree that we have high concentrations of poverty, and that is a public housing issue. But I do not believe that students need to be educated with white middle class in order to excel. I believe the students at King Elementary School can excel with the right services, resources, great teachers. That's the difference, I think, between what I'm saying to you and what I'm hearing from you. I do not believe that. When I was in Greenwich as a principal in a poverty school, my students closed the achievement gap because we got the resources we needed to provide those children a chance. And that's what we're missing, I believe.
If I can jump in, I'd say a couple of things. One is that we all know of those examples of high poverty schools that do work. But going back to the national data, how often does that happen? How often do we see successes with concentrated poverty? Remember the odds. 22 times less likely to be high performing. It would be bad enough if high poverty schools were half as likely, but 22 times less likely. We have to be doing something more creative. And I completely agree, there are magnet schools that are not magnetic, that don't work. There are lots of them out there. But I've seen enough success stories. I mean, there was one in Hartford I remember visiting right near some boarded up buildings. It was in a very distressed neighborhood. It had a long waiting list of middle-class families from the suburbs who wanted to send their kids into one of the poorest cities in the country because it had a Montessori program that was attractive to them. So in order to be effective, to be magnetic, we have to be smart about what sort of themes are put in place. And so rather than have some administrators sit in a room and say, well, let's try an arts magnet and see if it works, see if it attracts people. The more sophisticated districts have done surveys of parents and asked what would be attractive to you. And then, I'm this liberal, so I don't often invoke the marketplace, but you want to address the demand that's there. And then if it turns out that the Montessori school is oversubscribed and people are being turned away all the time, then you create 2 Montessori schools. I've seen it work in enough circumstances that I think there's some models out there for success. I just want to say one other thing, because I'm not often sitting next to a Secretary of Education, and so I just want to plant one idea in your mind here. When John King, who's until recently was the U.S. Secretary of Education, when he was in New York State, he devised a program in which he used school improvement grant money to create the opportunities for socioeconomic integration in failing schools. There was just a study released, a heartbreaking study, released last week, which found that the Obama administration had spent $7 billion on school improvement grants to try to make separate but equal work, to try to pour extra money into high poverty schools to improve the performance, and they found no result.
We got nothing.
No result. So we've got to start.
Many people knew that they wouldn't. Right?
Yes, yes.
That wasn't a surprise to lots of people.
Mm-hmm. And so I would just say, in terms of career advancement, John King went from Education Secretary in New York to U.S. Education Secretary, and that was one of his last acts as when he was there. It's just something to think about.
Can I just add one thing, because I understand what Secretary Rao's saying when she says it doesn't have to be middle-class white kids. I think it can be. Superintendent. Well, when he decides to retire,
Keeping it warm.
But I think it can be middle-class black kids or middle-class Hispanic kids. I think one of the big points is that I can fund your school to the point where you have every resource that's available to any other kid. That still only gets that kid that's living in concentrated poverty exposure to double the vocabulary, access to computers, access to books, access to all sorts of other activities 8 hours out of the day. The other 4 or 5 or 6 hours a day on school days, the other 7 days a week in the summertime, the other weekends all year long, that kid still goes home to a neighborhood where his peers are all in as much poverty as he is. And so they can't get together on a Saturday and play on the computer. They can't have the middle-class parent pick that kid up so they can all go play soccer. They can't have, it just doesn't exist because there are no resources outside of the school. And if we can get to a point where, as was pointed out, we're 2 miles from some wealth, those kids, any kid I've ever seen doesn't understand that, at age 6, that one kid's parents are wealthy and the other kid's parents are poor. All they care about is that the kid likes me and we play together, and that's as good as it gets. And I've never seen parents, anyway, be able to say to a kid, I'm sorry you can't bring your friend over because they're poor, or your friend can't come over because they're rich, or I'm not going to let your friend's parents take you to a soccer game because they have a car and we don't. And so that's where I think the advantage comes, is the sort of 2/3 of the rest of their lives that aren't in school when they have access to all those other amenities because their friend happens to have them.
Very good. All right, I'd like to get somebody else into the conversation now. John, no, wait, hold on 1 second. One more special guest in the audience, the Honorable Rick Gray, Mayor of Lancaster. Do you have a question or a comment? He's right here, John. Then we'll open it up.
Thank you. I'm going to exercise the prerogative of mayor and thank everybody on the panel. Really, this was very enlightening though a lot of us know it, and you know it for a long time, to hear people who have really studied it and worked at it, confirming what we all really know. We appreciate it, and you've done a real service to our community tonight, really. For those of you who aren't from Pennsylvania, you know what balkanization is. Well, in the Balkans, they describe it as Pennsylvaniaization because it's even worse. We have 2,500 municipalities. We have 500 school districts in Pennsylvania. We are so parochial, and it damages us so much that we actually brag that we're not the worst. Alabama and Ohio are worse than we are. So we're always proud when we finish ahead of Alabama. How about it, Mike? That said, you know, I've been thinking for years that the only way to solve this problem is a countywide school district. And then I talked to Mike. Well, I talked to Mike, you know, and I say 35 miles south of us they do it. It's called Maryland. You know, they have one school district in a county. And Mike says, you know, good luck. No way it will ever happen because of the parochialism of the school districts, but also of all the municipalities. I'm told on a regular basis, for example, homelessness. Well, that's a city problem. It's not a county problem. We're not included in the county. Half the homeless people in the city are from the county, but it's a city problem. Similarly, the superintendent will tell me people will move into the city school districts because of the special programs that are offered for kids that have learning disabilities. Those kids cost more to educate. We have the lowest income community in the county and the highest property taxes. It just isn't working. It doesn't work. That all said, now to my question, and I know Richard's a lawyer, I'm a lawyer, and maybe that's why I asked this question. Some states have reformed. I don't think we'll ever do it politically, at least in my lifetime. Politically, the courage just isn't there to bite that bullet. Some states have done it through litigation, from what I understand. I think New Jersey had some educational reform. Is there an opportunity to do that? It's been litigated once in Pennsylvania, but that was what, like 30 years ago maybe? Is there an opportunity, or has it been done elsewhere? Is it a possibility that we could actually force through the courts the politicians to do the right thing?
Did you want to answer that?
I'd be interested in your answer, but
And I asked Pedro that question. So.
Yeah, so as much as I'd like to chomp at the bit and answer that question, I'm probably a few distinctions I have. First, one of the state secretaries that has no desire to go federally and be a federal secretary, but I'm also probably one of the first secretaries that as a superintendent is now suing himself. So as a result of a pending lawsuit that you know, I'm on either end of, I can't comment. But I will say this. I think you know, as we're digging deeper around this issue of equity and the number of school districts we have, I mean, you know, I don't think there are very few people who will disagree with the fact that we have entirely too many school districts, and you know, as we discuss, municipalities as well, and we know this, and we know this to be a case. And over the course of the past 2 years, there have been 5 serious conversations we've had around consolidation of school districts. You know, a specific school district. So I say 5 conversations because we've staffed, we've done our due diligence in terms of research, you know, costing out, what a transition would look like for a merger of school districts, both because of, obviously for fiscal reasons, but also for educational reasons, just scale of economy, being able to offer a much more robust curriculum, being able to, you know, share services. And in all 5 cases, we've done our due diligence there has never been a school district willing to receive, to merge. And so if there were 5 districts interested in merging, that means there were at least between 20 and 25 school districts who were approached, to ask, and even with putting incentives in place, asked to consider, taking on additional students. And, to the point that, as a department, we could no longer afford to pay for that due diligence to kind of build the case. We have been successful in a number of cases. So I think in Wilkinsburg, we were able to tuition the students out to Westinghouse in Pittsburgh Public Schools, to build a large, or to have a larger high school in which we were able to do it in a much more cost-effective manner, while at the same time offering, doubling the advanced placement courses, career technical education courses offered. However, in that case, it did nothing to integrate the students and communities, racially, ethnically. We've had two other cases where we've tried to do the same, but there have been no takers. And here in Lancaster County, we have an administration overseeing 2 school districts, so Eastern Lancaster County and in Columbia. And even in that case, whereas there were some challenges where we tried to build some financial support and incentives, we were unable to do so. And then lastly, I will share this, and Mike kind of alluded to it, Representative Sterling alluded to it, excuse me. When we created the basic education funding formula, the conversation started by distribution of all current education funding, and there were a number of representatives, and did the math and realized that either through property tax, either what they contribute through earned income tax, or what their municipality contributes as it relates to a sales tax. They were not willing to make concessions to allow for all that they were paying into a system to go to another school district, regardless of what the need was. And right now, when you're looking at the number of municipalities that exist, and you're looking at the number of school districts that exist, the argument, whereas it makes sense from an equity perspective, at the end of the day, what ends up happening is they do the math, and our constituents across leadership across constituencies in the Commonwealth can tell you exactly how much their community contributes, through the individual tax bases, and they will argue to the end that they'll, put our recommendations on hold, that their money should, the funding that they contribute should remain local. And going, using the formula to fund and distribute new money, new funding, was the compromise to at least move away from being one of only 3 states that didn't have a formula to having a progressive formula. And that was the only way we could pass that bill in that bipartisan, bicameral manner.
If I could remain local, the money remain local, just goes to support my argument. Local means they're small, one of 2,500 communities. It doesn't mean the county.
Yeah. I think one reason local is viewed as a problem is because integration or consolidation is viewed as subtractive. It somehow takes away something I have by including you in that. Yeah? And I don't think, all due respect to you, Mayor, I don't think legislation is the way to do that. I think this is the way to do that. Because here we have a bunch of superintendents sitting around listening to us, yeah? And we have a bunch of community people sitting around listening to us, and people have to decide that it's in their best interest to start thinking about something else, right? If we remain sort of committed, married, I guess concretized in the status quo, forget it. But if we say forget it, we have to accept the fact that there's going to be kids who get screwed by our educational system. And we have to be able to live with that. And if we can all go to sleep at night thinking, yeah, you know, our kids are doing great. Those kids over there, they're the city's problem, not mine. Okay, I'm not sure there's anything I can do to convince you otherwise if that's going to be your belief. But if we can change that belief, then we won't need legislation because the community will come and demand it. They'll come to Secretary Rivera and say, you need better schools.
You have a lot more faith in the community than I do, to be honest with you. And I'm not talking
You're
about
much more wise
legislation.
than I am.
I'm talking about
I'm
litigation to force change,
Yeah.
not legislation to ask for change, but
Yeah.
forcing it.
If I can address some of that, and I'll preface this by saying part of the problem, I think, with consolidation, I think it was back in the 60s we did consolidation. If there's anybody in here that's old enough to remember, every community used to have their own school district. And we went from 2,500 school districts to 500 school districts. I've actually never researched it, but lore in the House is that the next year, more members in the House lost their seats than ever in the history of Pennsylvania because people were just absolutely convinced that the world was going to come to an end, going from 2,500 to 500. Now, what I've said is, you know, and everybody says, so we're not going to like 100 or 200 or countywide. Oh my gosh, we'd all be crushed. And I go, so then go stand on the steps of the Capitol and say you want to go back to 2,500 because that must make sense. And they're like, oh my God, that's stupid. Why would anybody do that? But they're wed that 500 somehow is a magical number that works.
I'm going to, I'm sorry, I'm going to take prerogative from the podium because I really want to get the community in this. I beg your pardon, Representative Sterla. Is that okay? John, because the point was just made that we've got a lot of members of the community and superintendents and others that want to get in. So we'll start right here.
Thank you for your information tonight. The question I have is, how do you understand anti-racism work within our school districts? And with the studies around post-traumatic slavery disorder being real, how do you assess that African American students will be successful by busing them out to middle-class neighborhoods in the state of Pennsylvania, where these gentlemen have shared that segregation is still very much real? How do you address sending Black kids and Latino kids out to these suburban neighborhoods and expecting them to be successful when they carry post-traumatic stress on their genes?
Well, I'm glad you brought up the issue of race directly because that's been underlying a lot of our discussion here and hasn't come out explicitly. One of the reasons I'm for socioeconomic integration is because legally there are impediments to directly using race, but the reason we have, and Jeff alluded to this at the beginning, the reason we have economically segregated schools is because of racism in this country and the effect of racism on housing patterns. The students who have participated, the African American students who have participated in school integration programs in a number of communities have faced a lot of racism when they go out into those communities. And nevertheless, the surveys find that they would do it again because the opportunities were so much better. That's a terrible thing to say, that you've got a choice between going to a concentrated poverty school where you're likely to get a poor education, or you can go to a better school where you're likely to face racism. No one should have to make that choice. But the people the African American students who did go through that process said that their lives were transformed. They had new opportunities that had opened up, and they suggested that even though they faced that racism, it was worth doing. And all the research studies back that up as well. So that's an imperfect answer to your question, but But that's what researchers have found. If I can sneak in a very quick answer to your question as well, Mr. Mayor, there are 3 states that have been involved in litigation over socioeconomic and racial segregation at the state level, state constitutional level. Connecticut, New York, and Minnesota. In Connecticut, there was a victory. That's why there's the Hartford school that I was talking about, the Montessori school that was bringing in students from the suburbs. So there was a victory in the case called Sheff versus O'Neill. And New York, as Mark mentioned, there was a lawsuit, the Painter case, where they lost. In Minnesota, there was kind of a compromise. They settled the case. Pennsylvania ought to be ripe for litigation like this. And the argument is, there are so many states where we've said equitable or adequate funding is required because we need adequate resources to provide students with a good education. But that's defined resources in a very, very narrow way as per pupil expenditure. But the resources in the school also include access to peers who are going to open up new horizons for you, access to parents who are going to be volunteering in the class and benefiting the school for that reason, access to great teachers. All those things are directly connected to concentrated poverty. So I know you're finishing your term as mayor and looking for something next to do, and I think there's an opportunity for you.
All right.
I also don't believe that you should view this as racial integration. That this is socioeconomic integration. A whole lot of African Americans and Latinos that have achieved a middle class status have left the city and are going to Hempfield and Conestoga Valley and Penn Manor, and so those schools will all tell you they have 10 or 20% of their kids that are minority students. If I take 30% of the kids from the city that are impoverished, whether they be black, white, Hispanic, and transport them there, now it's not there's 5 of me and 1,000 of them. It's there's 300 of me and 500 of them. Well, so what? Because there's sort of that safety in numbers kind of thing if you're just looking along racial lines. And so I think there's opportunities that this isn't about busing and saying we're going to take 10 kids that are black and put them in an all-white school. I don't think that's what anybody's talking about or believes that would work either.
I just received a text that the House management is getting a little nervous because we are about 25 minutes over, and we do have a few more questions. The gentleman who received the mic, yes, from audience right. You're next.
Gentlemen, I have a simple question. We have 500 school districts plus in the state, and we can't get them to come together, but here we are in the city of Lancaster. We have 1 high school, we have 2 middle schools, and we've got a dozen or more elementary schools. I don't know
16.
how many, but in any event, our elementary schools are all located in different neighborhoods, and they are socioeconomically not diverse. They're isolated in their own communities. Why can't we have our elementary schools in 1 or 2 elementary schools for the entire city and mix these kids up so that they get to know one another? When I was growing up, I lived in a town that was much larger area size than Lancaster City, and we had 2 elementary schools, 1 middle school, 1 high school. And I had friends that I used to play with. I begged my mother to take me, 2.5, 3 miles to go visit my friend and spend the weekend or spend the afternoon. We had sleepovers with kids that were from miles apart. And I don't understand why we point fingers at every other community around us when we do the same thing to ourselves.
You've stunned them. Someone want to take that briefly?
Well, I'm not sure what the exact statistics are. We were just talking about this, but I believe that almost. Oh, you have. Okay, then go ahead. I think they're all above 50% poverty. Some are at 90, but That's census tracts, not schools.
All,
But
all the elementary schools in the school district of Lancaster are high poverty, and, let's see, I guess there's like 13, how many, 14?
Yeah, 13.
13?
Yeah.
There's 13, and 4 of those 13 are very high poverty. So you can't, just using the elementary schools in the school district of Lancaster, there's no way you can deconcentrate poverty. It's got to be a regional.
There won't be any incremental benefit from doing that.
No, you've got to have, it's a regional solution.
And socioeconomic, because I know the kids who are children of F&M's professors, and the children who are in my neighborhood in the Northwest have a tremendously different socioeconomic outlook from the kids who live on the southeast side. And they don't know each other.
Ross is high. Wharton's the,
Well, Wharton School District, the one that all the F&M kids go to, the parents of F&M professors go to, the kids, Wharton is 71% poverty. You know, we can move them to one that's 72 or one that's 59, but I don't, yeah.
no.
That's why you have to go outside the city in order to get, because the middle class, whether it's black, white, or Hispanic, has fled the city.
Next question.
All right. I come from Africa. I come from the slums of Africa. My question goes to Richard first, because you mentioned something that touched me from where I come from. You mentioned James Coleman research. I know he did a 600,000 schools to come up with this report. And looking at your graphs, I saw that the kids that came from poor socioeconomic problems went to a better environment and they did well. And you mentioned something known as motivation. I was wondering, is that the problem that we have in the school district of Lancaster? And that goes to the secretary. You mentioned about kids that stayed in one elementary school, 12 of them did better than the percentage in Pennsylvania. Was that because they had the ability to stick with the task? Did they have were they motivated to stay with it? Did they have the grit, as Roosevelt say? Or are we missing something here? So I just wanted to understand if that's the case, or what's going on from a student perspective, or are we doing something to make sure our kids are motivated to go to the next level? Is that what we're lacking? Because I came from Africa. I'm here. I went to college. I got a degree. I came from slums. So is the motivation lacking, or what's going on? Those are two questions, if you can answer that.
Do you want me to answer both of those questions? All right, so Representative Sterler shared the anecdote in regards to the number of kids who stayed. But what I can share with you specific to what we know about urban schools and the school district of Lancaster, having been here for a number of years, and I won't, it's much more nuanced, but I don't want to, we could be here all night. First, when you take a look at the difference between the 12 students, versus the 12 student experience versus, the many of the other students that may, that may migrate in and out of a district from school to school. First, there are a number of social-emotional needs that aren't met, or environmental factors that have to be addressed, as part of, their educational experience. So first, which is why when I shared earlier, we do a really bad job of collecting the needed information that would drive us to make sound decisions around how to enrich and how to have a better educational system for students. So I'll share with you, for example, some of what we've seen happen here in this community, and something that we're now supporting at the state level, is integrating other services to schools, to better support the needs of students. So here, they're really investing in the community school model, and we probably have about a dozen plus school districts that are going aggressively with tying in social and emotional supports to schools to help meet the needs of that local community, but also the students that exist within that community. I mean, when you look at, specifically that school, Fulton or Carter McRae, they serve probably the largest percentage of homeless students, in the city. So just by definition as to, who you're serving as a student population, you're going to see, a high, transition of students. Or when you're looking at, many of those communities serve the largest number of refugee students. So you're going to see just embedded as part of that educational experience that they're going to, to move or, and migrate as they become more settled. So I think first, when you're looking at, meeting the needs of a diverse student population, as far as I'm concerned, you have to put measurements in place that are going to best determine where we're successful and where we're not successful. Secondly, I also understand that as a system of education, before, as we move towards, racially or socioeconomically integrating schools, there are a number of foundational issues that we haven't addressed for a long time here, in the Commonwealth. And one, it's as we spoke about, is just dealing with these issues of racial and ethnic inequities, and looking at linguistic inequities. And what we realized as a department, there were no policies that addressed, or no supports that existed for schools to reflect back on or to institute. So there are a lot of foundational things that I think we can get much more nuanced to answer the questions. To answer that question, and I'd be more than happy to connect with you offline so I don't take up, 25, 30 minutes over, but, I can definitely share the specifics with you if you're interested.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the questions. I know I would have hoped to have gotten more questions in, but we've gone way, way over time. I want to thank the panel very, very much. I'll make my way down and thank you personally, and I want to throw it now to Jeff for some final thoughts.
I wish we had more time. Thank you for coming out. It's exciting to see this conversation starting. My hope is that exactly what I just said, that this is just a start. This is the question that I would have asked our two main presenters if there was time. There's not time for that, so I'm going to throw the question out to you that have remained. What makes you hopeful about the feasibility of change? Can you go home tonight and think about what makes you hopeful? Is change possible in this community? Can we start doing things differently, or do we accept the way things are? Thanks, everyone.